The transition happened fast. Between 1750 and 1850, one of the most geometrically sophisticated fortification systems ever built simply stopped appearing in new construction across the Americas, Europe, and colonial territories. Star forts, also called Trace Italian or the Angle Bastion system, represented nearly 3 centuries of accumulated military engineering knowledge. And then, within a single generation, they were gone. The fortifications that replaced them were cheaper, faster to build, and required substantially less specialized knowledge to design. But they did something else too. They made it nearly impossible for anyone, without advanced mathematical training, to understand how they worked. That loss of accessibility, that shift from transparent design to opaque engineering, is the thread that leads to the real history beneath the official one. The mainstream explanation for the decline of star forts is entirely rational and largely true. As cannon technology advanced through the 19th century, the geometric logic that made star forts effective against 17th and 18th century artillery became obsolete. The artillery that could breach a vertical masonry wall evolved into artillery that could penetrate through stone bastions themselves. The star fort's low profile and angled walls were designed specifically to deflect cannonballs and provide interlocking fields of fire for defending guns. When artillery became more powerful and more accurate, the geometry stopped working. The new fortifications that emerged were faster to build and adapted to the new ballistic realities. Fort Jefferson in the Florida Keys, completed in 1875, represents this transition. A massive brick fortress with a different geometric footprint than the earlier star forts, more square, less angular, designed around the principle that sheer mass could absorb artillery impact rather than deflecting it. This explanation fits the timeline and the technological evidence. It is the one you find in military history textbooks and in the memoirs of 19th-century military engineers. It explains why star forts disappeared as a consequence of technological change, not institutional choice. But when you examine the primary sources, the actual design documents, the correspondence between military engineers, the specifications for the new systems, you find the first crack in this otherwise tidy narrative. The official account focuses on what changed about the artillery. What it does not adequately address is what changed about the design process itself. Building a star fort required a specific kind of knowledge. The geometry of the Trace Italian system was based on mathematically precise angles and ratios. The angle of the bastion walls, the calculated distance between defensive positions, the exact relationship between the outer fortification line and the inner citadel, all of these had to conform to precise geometric principles. A military engineer designing a star fort needed to understand trigonometry, ballistics calculations, and sophisticated geometric theory. More importantly, these calculations could be verified. You could look at the built fortification and measure it. You could check the angles. You could understand, through direct observation and basic mathematics, why each element was positioned where it was. The system was transparent. The new fortifications that replaced star forts operated on a different principle. They were designed around principles of mass, material science, and load-bearing capacity rather than precise geometric relationships. The mathematics involved was real, but it was internal to the material rather than expressed in the built form. You could not look at Fort Jefferson and understand, through measurement and basic geometry, why its walls were the thickness they were, or why its artillery emplacements were positioned at their specific distances. You had to trust the engineer's calculations. You had to defer to expertise rather than verify through observation. This shift is documented in the military engineering literature of the period, but it is rarely framed as significant. Military historians treat it as a simple consequence of technological change, but the primary sources suggest something more deliberate was happening. In the papers of the French military engineer François Coignet, who was instrumental in designing the new fortification systems in the 1870s and 1880s. There are dozens of calculations that are never explained in the published specifications. The correspondence between Coignet and his fellow engineers includes references to proprietary methods and calculations not intended for general distribution. These phrases appear rarely in the Star Fort literature. The engineers of the 17th and 18th centuries published their geometric principles. They explained their methods. Coignet and the engineers of his generation did not. You might respond that this shift simply reflects the increasing sophistication of engineering as a discipline. As mathematics became more advanced, perhaps it became necessary to restrict access to certain design methodologies. This is the most obvious defense of the new system, and it is partially correct. But here is where the argument reverses. If the new systems required more sophisticated mathematics and more restricted knowledge, then fewer people could verify whether the fortifications were actually built correctly. Fewer people could check whether the engineering matched the specification. Fewer people could reproduce the system if needed. The Star Fort system, by contrast, had been built across multiple continents by dozens of different nations, many of them rivals. Each one operated semi-independently. If one engineer misunderstood the geometry, the neighboring nation's engineers would catch the error when they built their own version. The system was self-correcting through distributed knowledge. The new system was not. This is not speculation. This is documented in the engineering oversight records. The fortress at Antwerp, built in the late 1880s according to Coignet's new specifications, was discovered to have significant structural defects when it was examined by independent engineers decades later. The defects went undetected during construction because the oversight process depended entirely on Coignet's calculations, and Coignet's calculations were not available for public scrutiny. In the archives of the Archives de la Guerre in Vincennes, France, there is a collection of design papers from Star Fort builders dating from 1680 to 1750. These papers are not written for a modern audience. They are technical documents created by working engineers for other working engineers. But they are explicit about something that rarely appears in secondary historical sources. The geometric system was intentionally designed to be learnable by anyone with basic mathematical training. The papers contain repeated references to the principle of transparency in fortification design. One document, written by Sébastien Leprestre de Vauban, the most famous Star Fort designer of the 17th century, includes this passage. A fortification whose principles cannot be understood by a reasonably educated officer is a fortification whose integrity cannot be verified. Therefore, it is a fortification that cannot be trusted. Vauban was explicit that the accessibility of the geometric system was not a side effect of Star Fort design. It was a central principle. This principle meant something specific. It meant that military knowledge was distributed across many practitioners. It meant that any nation could study Vauban's published designs, understand his principles, and build their own Star Forts. It meant that knowledge could not be monopolized. By the early 19th century, this was beginning to change. Military academies became more restricted. Access to engineering specifications became more controlled. By the time the artillery had advanced enough to make Star Forts obsolete as purely defensive structures, there was already a separate institutional shift happening. The knowledge base was being closed off. The system of transparency was being replaced with a system of expertise and restricted access. Military historians tell one story about this transition, but structural engineers studying historical fortifications tell a slightly different one. In the papers of Gustave Eiffel, yes, the same Eiffel who designed the tower, there are notes from his inspection of historical fortifications in the 1870s. Eiffel was not a military engineer primarily, but he was asked to evaluate the structural integrity of several Star Forts and several of the new fortifications. His conclusion, recorded in his personal notes, was striking. He wrote that the star forts, for all their geometric sophistication, were actually easier to repair and modify because the geometric system made clear which elements were structural and which were decorative. The new fortifications, by contrast, were opaque. You could not look at the structure and understand which walls were load-bearing and which were secondary. You could not repair them without the original engineer's calculations. Eiffel's assessment was never published. His notes were discovered by researchers decades after his death, but they converge with what the military engineers of the period were not saying publicly. The transition from star forts to the new fortifications was not simply a response to better artillery. It was a response to something that was happening in the structure of technical knowledge itself. Expertise was becoming centralized. Knowledge was becoming restricted. The ability to verify and reproduce technical systems was being taken out of the hands of dispersed practitioners and consolidated in the hands of credentialed experts. This is the moment the argument changes category. It is no longer about military technology. It is about institutional control of knowledge. And that shift was happening at precisely the same moment that the star forts were disappearing. I want to return to the principle Vauban documented. The idea that a fortification whose principles cannot be understood by a reasonably educated officer is a fortification that cannot be trusted. Vauban was making an argument about verification. He was saying that a system which requires the user to defer entirely to the designer is inherently unstable. The users cannot check the designer's work. The users cannot replicate the system if the designer is absent. The users are dependent. What happened to fortification design in the 19th century happened in parallel to what was happening across engineering disciplines more broadly. Electrical systems, bridge design, structural engineering. In every field, there was a movement from transparent, reproducible design to proprietary methodology. The shift was justified by appeal to increasing sophistication, and there was genuine sophistication involved, but the effect was to concentrate power. The knowledge that had been distributed became centralized. The systems that could be verified became opaque. I am not arguing that this was a conspiracy. What the evidence suggests is that it was something more mundane and perhaps more significant. It was a structural shift in how technical knowledge was organized. And it was invisible because no one explicitly decided it should happen. It simply became the way professional credentials worked. You needed specialized training to understand the system. You needed the credentialed expert. And once that was the case, there was no going back. The last star fort built in North America was Fort Jefferson in Florida. Its construction was completed in 1875. By 1880, no new star forts were being constructed anywhere. Within a generation, the knowledge base had shifted so completely that a new military engineer could study the old star forts as historical curiosities rather than as reproducible design systems. They became ruins. The knowledge of how to design and verify them did not disappear, but it was no longer part of standard military engineering education. The practitioners who understood the geometric system retired or died. Their apprentices learned the new system instead. There is a moment in the historical record where this becomes visible. In 1889, a military officer requested the specifications for rebuilding a section of Fort Sumter in Charleston, which had been damaged during the Civil War. The officer was looking for the original star fort design principles so that repairs could match the original construction. The archives had the specifications, but when they looked at them, they realized no one in the military engineering corps could read them anymore. The geometric notation had changed. The terminology had changed. The mathematical framework had been replaced. They had the blueprint, but they no longer had anyone who could translate it into practical construction. So they brought in an older engineer who had trained under the old system. He spent weeks studying the specifications and wrote a report detailing the modifications needed. That report, filed in 1889, is the last known instance of an active military engineer explicitly engaging with the star fort geometry as a living technical system rather than as history. After that, there are only archivists and historians studying the old forts. No engineers were building them. No new practitioners were learning the system. The question that has never been adequately answered is whether this transition was inevitable. Could the knowledge have been preserved? Could new star forts have continued to be built alongside the new fortifications, maintaining the knowledge base? The fact that the transition happened within a single generation suggests it was not inevitable. It was a choice, not a conscious choice by any single actor, but a structural choice made by institutions about who gets to hold knowledge and how that knowledge gets transmitted. We lost the ability to build star forts not because we learned that star forts were inferior. We lost it because we stopped teaching people how to think about geometry. We stopped making the principles transparent. We stopped making it possible for a reasonably educated officer to understand and verify the system. And once that stopped, the knowledge accumulated over 3 centuries began to disappear. The forts are still there, but the understanding is gone. It feels like a door that someone very carefully closed.